Politics. It's a big, scary word that may frighten a lot of people. For a lot of people, they may not want to be political. They may want a quiet, peaceful, normal life. One where they aren't hassled by the power intrigues of statesmen and politicians. But can one truly be apolitical in our current society, or in fact, indeed, in any society, in any social context? Let's think about it. This 7 Up bottle. You may be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with politics, anyways? It's just a 7 Up bottle, right? But from where it was made, who made it, why was it made, how was it made, the resources used to make it, where was the resources used to make it supplied from, what was the cost of acquiring these resources, the tariffs, the taxes for transporting these resources, the tariffs, the taxes for transporting this manufactured 7 Up bottle, its distribution in the marketplace. All of these, in some way or another, actually do link back very much to politics. In fact, even if one was to say, for example, these have more so to do with economics, economics undoubtedly is very much a part of politics. And so, in a way, most of the things we do throughout our lives, even the very minute, small things that we don't really give a big notice at first, are very much political in nature or have links to politics. So, can one truly be apolitical? Let's think about it. Politics, as I would define at least, really and truly is simply just the way society is organized. It's the way that we run our society, it's the system that we choose by which to operate and organize our society around. And in this sense, society itself is a political apparatus, so to speak. Now, the question is that does this affect the individuals involved in the society? I would venture to answer yes, and I would say that it indeed is the case that these politics go down and affect the very individuals who constitute that society. Now, some may assert the individual right of people to be apolitical or for people to not engage in politics, and I do agree with this to a certain extent. People have the right not to get involved in power politics. People have the right not to get involved in power intrigues. People have the right to lead a quiet life and not to get involved in the political arena. But one can truly not be apolitical in a broader sense. Because if politics is simply the way that we organize our society and individuals are based within their social context, and if individuals being based in their social context, all of the decisions about that society regarding the way that society is run, the rules that apply to the society, impact and affect the individual himself, then surely the individual cannot be apolitical. By nature, he would be a political being. In reality, politics affects all parts of our lives, down to our individual rights, the taxes we pay, the work we do, the things we own. Politics will affect all of them inevitably. The point that some may raise about individualism, or that individuals should, not necessarily have to engage in politics, this is somewhat based on a flawed perception of the individual, because it assumes that the individual is an isolated, atomized sort of consumer unit, which exists in isolation from the rest of the society. But in reality, the individual is very much based within his social context. The individual is not inescapable. He cannot escape and he cannot defy the social context he is raised in. He may choose to conform or comply with certain social norms. He may choose to react and rebel against them. But he is fundamentally based within his broader social context. And as we said before, if politics is simply the way society is organized and individuals are based within their social context, then by necessity, individuals have to be political by nature. I know that some may also assert that individual rights are, give people the ability to not be political. But there's an issue with this. Individual rights, especially in the Western context, in the first place, are predicated, first of all, upon an opposition to state power and state tyranny. Individual rights, by necessity, are a check on state power and state tyranny. And second of all, there's often an assumption with liberty that you will have responsibilities. In other words, you will use your liberty in a positive manner to fulfill your responsibilities to the society, to individuals around you, to yourself. And this is the point, that rights come with responsibilities, social responsibilities more importantly. As Burke once mentioned, that the restraints placed upon man in a society, as well as his liberties, are to be contended amongst his rights. Meaning, the way that the society is organized fundamentally affects the individual. The guarantee of individual rights in and of itself is a precisely political phenomena that is there to check state power and allow the individual to be the most efficient version of himself so that he can contribute the most to society that is within his capacity and predisposition to do so. Individual rights, by their nature, are political, so we can't really and truly use the argument of individual rights to say that you should be apolitical, or that a person can be apolitical on the basis of his individual rights. That doesn't necessarily make sense. Now, of course, there is an important point though to be made, and there's an important nuance here. Just because a person, by his being in a social context, or because individuals are based in their social context, necessarily to a certain degree embodies some political position within the society, or have some say in the politics of the society, or that politics affects him, this doesn't mean that he has to necessarily take an active political position. And this is true and a valid point. Individuals don't necessarily have to be actively involved in the political arena. They can choose not to do so. Otherwise, everybody would just be running for the Senate, or everybody would be running for a position in a political party, and society would not function if everybody was trying to be political. And this simply isn't practical and feasible. So you can't necessarily expect everybody to take an active political position. At the same time, it's not the case that individuals are simply passive sort of consumer units who lack agency in the world, because their actions can bring about change in their society and can bring about change in the world. So, although it's not necessarily the case that the individual has to be actively involved in the political arena, we do have to acknowledge that by necessity, off of his being based in the social context, his or her being based in the social context, the individual will inevitably, to a certain degree, have a sort of political import, or he will have things that he does which will be of political consequence, or things that happen to him that are of political consequence. And we can see this in examples such as taxes, right? Taxes inevitably are linked to politics, but also affect the individual. If tomorrow, let's say we have a communist society instead of a capitalist society, and we have communal ownership of property, that will very much affect the individual. And you can't say that the individual can just sort of be detached from his social context there. That simply doesn't make sense. If we look broadly at the rest of human history, this very much has always been the case, that politics have affected the individual, and to a certain degree, the individual has had to be political. If not within the broader sort of political arena, then at least within his own, let's say, community or close relatives. For example, if you take in primitive times, let's say hunter-gatherer tribes, they may not have been political in the modern sense of the word, but they were still very much political in their own context. If you have to listen to the tribe leader and you have to decide who goes out on a hunt, that is very much political, not in the modern sense, but in your own context. As such, it's not correct to say that the individual can just be removed from his political social context and simply be apolitical, although he can sort of avoid having an active political position or active political participation. We would have to concede at the end of the day that all individuals have some sort of political influence, not necessarily political influence in the active political arena, but his very being, his very essence within the social context carries a political implication that cannot be ignored.